In Police Squad, there's a line about a little hunchback at the office, and apparently that's how the Supreme Court says it's okay for cops to make decisions these days. I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com, as well as by our friends over at the Patriot Post. You can find a link to the Patriot Post in the description below and get yourself a free copy of the Patriot's Primer on American Liberty. I'm with Stephen Green and Bill Whittle this week. We decided to do it this way this time. And gentlemen, the Supreme Court has just ruled 8-1 in a case called Kansas versus Glover. And it gets a little complicated, but the upshot of it is this. A guy's driving along in his car, we'll call him Glover, and the deputy sheriff decides to run his plate and discovers that the owner of that car is not a licensed driver. He makes the inference, the hunch, so to speak, that the driver of the car is the guy who is not licensed to drive the car and decides to pull him over, and he gets charged as a habitual unlicensed driver. The defense that Glover mounts is basically that they violated his Fourth Amendment rights and that the police should not be able to pull somebody over just because they don't have any evidence that their hunch is incorrect. If you followed me to this point, you're a much smarter person than I am. But Stephen Green, I find myself a strange bedfellow with Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor and find it intriguing that she stands alone not only against the conservatives on the court, but against the liberals as well in basically saying that we've given the state more power to be intrusive in our lives by basically letting them act upon a hunch to stop you when you're driving your car. Are you okay with this, or are you finding yourself wanting to snuggle up to Sonia Sotomayor as well?
Occasionally, rare occasion. It's like it's kind of like finding a gem in a pile of pony stuff. A progressive gets one of these things right. Ron Wyden, the Democrat out of Oregon or Washington State, I can't remember, very solid on privacy issues in the Senate. We could use more Democrats like him if we have to have more Democrats. Same thing with Al Franken before he got driven out of the Senate. Very good guy on privacy concerns. And Sotomayor is on this one, I think, in the right as well. Let me give you an example to kind of follow the logic, I think, that the court presented or that you presented as what happened. Let's say a police officer is driving past my house and he sees the number on my mailbox and he knows what street he's on and he thinks, gosh, I could have sworn I saw something in the paper about there being a tax lien on that house. And so he pulls over at the curb and he walks up to the door and he comes on into the house and demands to see my tax records. And I'm kind of flustered. And okay, I give him the paperwork and he goes, oh, sure enough, you've got a tax lien on this house and you haven't paid up, so I'm going to take you to jail. That's kind of the situation we have here. Really, the only difference is apparently we have fewer rights, or the Fourth Amendment is somehow narrower when we're in our own cars as opposed to in our own homes. I don't think so. I think the court decided very badly on this one, and I'm very sad to see some really solid individual rights members of the court, like Clarence Thomas, siding for the state on this one.
Bill Whittle, the standard used to be something called reasonable suspicion that would have to precede a police officer making a stop like this. And I'm using the phraseology now of scotusblog.com. It's a Supreme Court blog that kind of summarizes the case. And bear with me for this description. They say this was the holding of the court's 8-1 majority. When a police officer lacks information negating an inference that a person driving is the vehicle's owner, an investigative traffic stop made after running the vehicle's license plate and learning that the registered owner's driver's license has been revoked is reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. Were you able to follow that? And if so, are you on board with the court's majority?
I wasn't able to follow it, but I was able to follow the Fourth Amendment on account of the fact that it was written by people who were determined to make clarity their utmost goal. I don't understand the argument that they're making. Can you decode that for me?
I'm not sure.
Want to read it again?
I'm not sure that I can, but
the
basically,
inference is where you lost me.
Yes, negating the inference is basically if a police officer has a hunch and there's nothing to prove that his hunch isn't so in what he can observe, then he can go ahead and make that traffic stop.
No, that's got that absolutely backwards. I have a lot of respect for police officers, and just like doctors, there are just a very small number of police officers and doctors that cause virtually all of the problems. I have a lot of respect for police officers, and I understand that police work cannot be done, even on the level of traffic violations, without some degree of a police officer using his experience and his accumulated knowledge, his wisdom, and hunches. All of that. I get all that. But that metric is exactly backwards. It's not the police officer does not have a right to pull you over and search you if there's no reason why he shouldn't. You know, the whole I'm in favor of using police judgment and individual judgment. I'm against, as a general rule, these kind of ironclad laws, you know, and mandatory sentencing, all this stuff. But clearly, to say that a police officer has the right to basically run your tags, which is an invasion of your privacy, you're out in public, you're going about your business, to say that he has the right to do that unless there's a reason that he sees not to, I just simply don't understand how that got to be an 8-1 decision, frankly. I mean, yes, I am 100% on Sotomayor's side on this, and I'm glad to be on her side on this. It makes me happy when I can see something like this. Clarify for a second there,
Bill, the question wasn't whether it's okay for him to run the plates. I'll get to that a little bit later. But the question was whether they could make the stop. And the stop was based on the inference that the guy who's registered as the owner of that vehicle was, in fact, the guy who was driving the vehicle, and that guy was reported to be without license.
How would the police know that the guy who is registered is the driver? How on earth can he know that?
He did not. He had a hunch that the guy driving the vehicle was, in fact, the owner of the vehicle. And that's the whole question is, did he have the right to stop that guy? And the Supreme Court said yes, because it was a reasonable hunch. And there doesn't need to be reasonable suspicion as long as there's nothing that would counteract that hunch.
Well, let me give you an example based on my lifetime in law enforcement and being out on the streets as a amateur police officer 20 hours a day for the last 40 years. When I stand and look at the 405 freeway and see 500,000 cars going by in an hour or two, my hunch is that the people who are driving those cars actually own them. Now, that's just a hunch. And you know, I don't have the empirical evidence to back up the fact that most of the people who are driving the cars are the actual owners of their cars, but I'm just going to go with a wild hunch on that one and say that, yes, I'd be willing to bet that's the case. What an absurd thing to say. He had a hunch that the person who was driving the car might in fact have been the person who's registered to be driving the car. This is the defense. How did this ever happen? How did this case ever get to the Supreme Court? To say that I had a feeling that the guy who was driving the car was the owner of the car, and I know the car has the owner of the car has got license problems. I'm going to assume that the guy who's driving the car is the owner of the car. If you're telling me that's the legal reason for him invading the person's Fourth Amendment rights to protection from unreasonable search and seizure and so on, no, the police officer has to have some reason to suspect that something criminal is going on here, and to turn this around is a shocking violation. Now, when I hear, look, I got to tell you one other thing. When I hear stories like this, and I hear people like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and all the rest citing what seems to be an insanely bad decision, that usually tells me that there's some part of this I'm not getting or not understanding. But if the case is factual as you relay it, then I simply can't understand how this was an 8-1 decision against. It should have been a 9-0 decision overturning this idea, unless I have a hunch that there's something wrong. You know, that I don't think that guy committed a crime, therefore I'm not going to violate his civil rights. No, it works the other way around. I can't believe they didn't see it.
Well, it got to the Supreme Court, as you said. You know, how did this get to the Supreme Court? It actually, Glover was successful at the district court as well as the Kansas state Supreme Court. I suspect it got to the U.S. Supreme Court because he was making a Fourth Amendment defense, and therefore, because it had constitutional or U.S. constitutional import, that's why it even came before the Supreme Court. It's a good defense. Yeah, and here's my read on this. First of all, I back up before the actual matter under consideration in this case and say, why is a police officer running a plate on a car of a guy that the police themselves acknowledge was not in obvious violation of any kind of law? I don't like the idea of law enforcement officers being able to say, hey, that citizen who's not breaking any kind of law that I can tell, I have a hunch that I should run his plate. So now you're accessing private information about me, which is in the public sphere, of course. They have access to this information, but you're doing that based on nothing. There should be some basis for which a police officer has a right to begin that initial level of probing into your life. And then to be able to say from that point, well, that guy is probably the owner whose license has been revoked. It could have been his son. It could have been his dad. It could have been, a relative. It could have been a friend borrowing the car. But it doesn't matter. I can initiate a stop if there's nothing that would indicate to me that the guy driving the vehicle isn't the guy who owns the vehicle. First of all, I'm shocked at two things. Number one, that so many on the Supreme Court saw it this way after the Kansas Supreme Court saw it exactly the opposite way. And secondly, that I find myself in agreement with Sonia Sotomayor. And thirdly, that Sonia Sotomayor is in disagreement with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There are too many questions at this. I think we need to be exceedingly reluctant to give up our individual liberties in exchange for what? We got a guy who's a habitual unlicensed driver. How many unlicensed drivers do you think actually drive on American roads today? I would hazard a guess, all of them, or something very close to that. So this is not something that's a threat to national security. This is something that's actually a commonplace violation of law, I'll grant you that we shouldn't say, let's give the state increased rights to probe our records and pull us over and make us stop based on a hunch, as long as nothing would counteract that hunch. I'm with Sonia Sotomayor on this. And again, I'm going to go back and read the entire decision. I've only had a chance to read sections of her dissent, articles about it, as well as the summary page that the court issues as to why this case was held this way. And I want to read Associate Justice Clarence Thomas's opinion for the majority and see if there's anything I'm missing from this. If there is, we'll do another episode on this to probe into that. But notwithstanding, this shocks me. It should shock you. And I think we need to be much more vigorous in defending our liberty. I want to thank the members at BillWhittle.com who are very vigorous at defending liberty for sponsoring this program. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.